The Venus event claims that around 2 to 3,000 years ago, and we don't have an exact date, so that's going to always be important to remember, but it's somewhere around there, right? Between 2 and 3,000 years ago. There was a cataclysm on this planet that quite literally reshaped the entire surface. It changed all of the continents to more or less what we see today. It created the current oceanography, topography, basically everything, or not everything, but most of everything that we see today was created during this event. And yes, that also includes all of the mountain ranges that we find on the planet. And if you're wondering, wait, what do you mean? Like things like Mount Everest? Like the Alps? Like the Himalayas? Is that what you mean? Yes, quite literally, yes. All of these mountain ranges rose up during the memory of mankind. Our ancestors were literally there to witness all of these mountain ranges appear. How do we know this? Well, it's simple. We know this because they tell us this. That it is literally that simple. Everywhere we go on this planet, we find cultures talking about how the mountains were created and how they were created overnight. This did not take millions and billions of years. Uniformitarianism had nothing to do with it. The mountain ranges were created overnight. Now, for your average person, I get it, this sounds insane. And the reason why is because we have all been trained in uniformitarianism. Everything has to take billions of years. Plate tectonics is supposed to be responsible for all of the mountain ranges that we see. Essentially, two magical plates smash into one another and mountain ranges are pushed up over millions of years. Of course, for some weird reason, erosion is not factored into this pushing, so, it gets a little weird, but we could talk about that in a bit. But we have a problem. Because the eyewitness testimony from our ancestors says nothing about millions and billions of years. The mountains rose overnight. To make it even more interesting, the more geology has advanced, the more we have discovered that mountain ranges all over this planet are indeed younger than mainstream geology currently admits. Mainstream geology has actually found tons of evidence that support the fact that mountain ranges quite literally did rise up within the memory of mankind. The geologists who are willing to go down this path, however, will put this period of time about 10,000 years ago. Now that's still crazy. That's still fairly insane if you think about it. Because, most geologists say millions and billions of years, whereas newer geologists are starting to admit that, the evidence really does support a younger situation for some weird reason. And then, of course, to compound that matter, they are willing to look to our ancestors' recordings and start to take them, semi-seriously. So when I make the claim that the mountain ranges rose up overnight, it's not me being unscientific, just pulling garbage out of my butt. No, it's a real situation, and it's a real problem for mainstream geology now. But I get it. The concept sounds crazy. If you are still, beholden to general geology, you really have nothing in your toolbox that can help explain how mountain ranges could appear overnight. There's really nothing that anybody really has in that area. The best people have... let's cover some of this. All right, let me go over the basics of what the mainstream generally believes. And I guarantee you, probably a lot of you are going to fall into this category, which is fine. This is why I want to cover it. It's not an attack on anybody. What I want to show is that if you do indeed fall into one of these mainstream categories, for example, you still believe in plate tectonics, right? You still believe uniformitarianism. You believe in the Ice Age. You believe, everything takes millions and billions of years. What I want to do is I want to show you that there are other real scientific explanations that are superior to what the mainstream currently uses right now to explain mountain uplift. And I know, oh boy, a geology show, it's going to be awesome. No, it is awesome. See, most people hate geology for one simple reason. It's because it's taught in a uniformitarianist way. When you start to learn about geology, and I was in the same boat until about a decade ago, everything takes millions and billions of years, so suddenly, geology just kind of becomes boring for the vast majority of people because that's just too long, right? Millions and billions of years relative to a human lifespan is insane. You're not really going to be able to do any real good science in that category because you are not going to live long enough to witness any of the outcomes, right? If you were to adhere to that concept, it's just too disconnecting. It's a very basic psychological problem. It's the problem of psychological disassociation. If you can get yourself into a disassociative state relative to a topic, you're not going to care anymore. You are going to lose focus, you are going to lose interest, and ultimately you just don't care. I mean, it's just not relevant to your life anymore. And that's what has happened to geology. Right? We're taught, oh yeah, there's these two plates and they smash together and over 1 billion years, mountains form. And, on the surface, that sounds like it makes sense. All right, fine. Two huge plates smashing together builds up, somehow magically forces up mountains without cracking and breaking them and turning them into rubble. Fine, okay, whatever. But nobody asks that question either, though, right? Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. But here we see another example of a disassociative property with respect to a geological answer. Right, the claim is two plates smashed together over millions of years. Once again, the plate situation is too big for a human to really, truly appreciate. And then when you mix in that kind of a timeline, there's just nothing you can really do, right? You can't really do an experiment ultimately that's going to prove plate tectonics because you need a planet-size laboratory to really be able to do this. If you're going to prove that that's the case, that's the kind of a thing you need. And of course, we don't have that. Now, I know there are those people who will say, yeah, but we have simulations. Do not get me started on simulations. Simulations will provide you with exactly what you want to see. For every time you hear one of these mainstream articles from, the scientific community, right, trust the science, and they say, well, simulations prove XYZ, blah, 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 and it makes it sound really smart. But check this out. For every one of those simulations that are said to support the mainstream ideology, there are countless versions of that simulation that didn't. And this is what people never pay attention to. They never look at the results of the quote-unquote failed parts of the simulation. Because more often than not, these simulations will have a completely different outcome once they start to enter all of the data. And of course, once you get a different outcome than what the experimenters want, what happens? The experimenters throw out the other data. They don't look at the simulation and be like, oh, well, wait a second. We're getting different results. We really should follow these results instead. No. They will tweak that simulation until it gives them exactly what they want. Or at least close enough to where they can go and make an article or a paper that says, yes, we figured it out. Here it is. Here's the simulation. We don't have to think anymore. This is how the scientific community is run. This is what is going on. Right? Nobody is questioning the other simulations. And then, of course, to top it all off, at the end of the day, a simulation is bad anyway, because it's only going to be able to work with whatever data you can put into it. And that's it. So if there's stuff that they don't know about, if there are completely new sciences or other variables or whatever that the simulation has not been programmed with, it's never going to give you the real result. It's not possible. It is literally impossible to use a simulation right now to prove any of this stuff. It doesn't work. A great example is when they were simulating galaxies, right? and they were using relativity and all that garbage. And what they immediately found is that their simulations, they weren't lining up with what relativity predicted. Right? The galaxies really should have spun apart. They really should have just blown themselves outward because there was not enough gravity to hold the galaxy together. Right? Galaxies spin. Right? They have that motion, which is another thing the mainstream can't explain with any real credibility. But anyway, galaxies should have fallen apart. Right? They should have spread out everywhere all over the universe. But they're not doing that, right? They're spinning and they're holding together. So what the hell is holding them together? Well, scientists or cosmologists or whatever, they had to make up dark matter and dark energy to get these galaxies to stick together. So in their simulation, what they did is they found their simulation was giving them the result they did not like. And so they added mystical variables to ensure that the simulation gave them the answer they wanted. And then they wrote a paper on dark matter and dark energy and said, wow, we made such a huge, amazing discovery. We have absolutely zero real-world evidence that any of this stuff exists, but we put it in our simulation and it worked, so it must exist. That must be the only possible answer that could ever exist to explain why galaxies do not spin themselves out of existence. Right? This is what the scientific community did. It is no different with geology. They run simulations, they show the... Okay, the plate tectonic simulations are hilarious. All right, and oh wait, I think I got off track. I was trying to explain why geology doesn't suck to learn. Stick with me. Okay, here, I'll just spoil it. Geology doesn't suck to learn because geology does not require millions and billions of years. Not only does it not require millions and billions of years to make things, it also makes things in some of the craziest ways you could imagine and opens up completely new sciences to you as somebody who's trying to learn stuff. All right, that's why it's good to learn geology, and especially if you want to understand human past, if you want to understand anything with our history, this is actually required. Right? Anybody who studies ancient history comes to the inevitable conclusion that you have to be a polymath. You have no choice but to branch out to all kinds of other avenues and other sciences to really start to understand what's going on in the past, because there's so much crazy garbage going on in the past. You know, it's not simple. You can't just pick up a book, read Herodotus and understand everything. A lot of historians do that, but those are low-level garbage historians. Don't be a low-level garbage historian. You don't want to do that. You want to be a good historian, and a good historian realizes that they have to go out and they have to learn things like stratigraphy. Why do you have to learn stratigraphy? Because if you don't, you will not understand archaeology. Right? You can't. You have to learn stratigraphy. The problem is that archaeologists don't understand stratigraphy in the sense of where the hell does it come from. They just assume that mainstream geologists have this figured out, that layers just appear on top of each other and really quickly solidify into rock, and then it freezes history into these layers that we can then use to date, and that makes logical sense. So that's what we think, and then they go on from there, and then it makes me want to kill myself because it's ridiculous, and they have no idea what they're talking about, but that doesn't matter. The point is that to be a good historian, you have got to learn all kinds of garbage. And one of the things we have to understand is geology. However, the problem with geology is that mainstream geology doesn't have any real answers for a lot of stuff. Right? For example, a very simple example is something like, why do we find over 100 feet of debris, rock and dirt and other detritus, on top of, say, Greek ruins? Right? That is a legitimate geological question. Right? Even if you agree with mainstream chronology, which is completely wrong, but even if you believe with mainstream chronology, right, you put the Greeks 2,500 years ago, or wherever you want to put them, where did all of this debris come from? 100 feet of rock and debris on top of ruins? What are you talking about? Right? It takes millions of years for debris to build up over something. So how did it happen in only thousands? And this is ignored. Right? They have to ignore this. Archaeologists ignore this. They just say, oh, no, we have the layers and we're good and we can date the layers, and then they shut up. They don't say anything else. Right? That's where they stop. Nobody questions where the hell the layers came from. And it's a legitimate problem. It's something that everybody should ask, right? If you're going to tell me that a coin is dated to 1,500 years ago, and you find it under 300 feet of dirt and rock, I mean, you better have a really good explanation. And they don't. They don't. They just ignore it. They have to. They have to ignore it. Oh, it's just a oddity, or it's a fake, or whatever, even though they found it, right? Anyway, you get my point. Anyway, so geology is important, and geology is not boring. And that's what I wanted to show you guys, is that geology is freaking amazing. Like, it's crazy. Like, it's one of the most crazy sciences that I've ever been exposed to. And we're going to show you that in this show. We're going to go over the science. Okay, yeah, you get it. Okay. Where the hell was I talking about? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I was rambling about plate tectonics. All right, let's start there. So plate tectonics, the theory that two plates come together, they smash together over millions of years, billions of years, and they create mountains. This sounds good if you do not ask a single basic question. When you start to ask basic questions like, why the hell do we find perfectly folded rock in zigzag formations that are not cracked at all? Where did that come from? Now, a mainstream person, a mainstream geologist, will immediately say something like, well, billions of years ago, heat and pressure made that, yeah. And then they run away, right? Because that's all they have, heat, pressure, and time. That's it. There's nothing else. So somehow, magically, heat, pressure, and time creates these, amazing, perfect zigzag formations with zero cracks. And then this rock formation comes up out of two plates smashing together, which really should be cracking everything in existence. But no, it forces everything up perfectly, and it sits on the surface, and it's just happy there uncracked, right? They give you that answer, and then they run away. Because they have nothing else. They can't follow up with anything if you ask the question, well, how the hell did that really happen? I mean, how did heat and pressure create that particular zigzag pattern? Can you please show me experimentally? Right? And they have to run away. Or the best they can do is they can say, oh, well, see, you just kind of layer stuff over time, and then heat and pressure shows up and then kind of condenses this stuff for some weird reason and keeps it all within its own layers and doesn't mix it together, and then eventually it cools and then is shoved up to the top of the plate. I can't even make up an excuse. I can't even think of a good excuse a geologist would have for me. Right? They have nothing. There is nothing a geologist has for us when it comes to any of these rock formations. There's nothing there. Right? It's funny when you look at simulations of the plates, of plate tectonics, and you see how the plates have to move and shift to get to where we are today. It's absolutely hilarious. I mean, you have all these magically created plates going up, down, left, right, up, center, over here, moving around, and there is absolutely no logic to it whatsoever. It's literally just some dumbass sitting there playing with a computer simulation trying to fit stuff together like a puzzle. That's it. That's all it is. There's no science behind it, right? There's no explanation as to why those plates would move in those directions that they move in to create what we see today, right? There's no explanation for any of it. Why would one plate go one way and another go the other way while another goes in a completely other direction? What is going on? What the hell are the processes here? Right, once again, the Earth has a dynamo in the center that heats everything up, and the energy comes out, and for some weird reason, it comes out in ways that push the plates in completely stupid ways that make no sense, and they got nothing. There's nothing there. All right, the plate tectonic theory is a humiliation ritual. It's stupid, and that's what it is. It's stupid. It's stupid. But people don't look at it as if it's stupid because it has otherwise intelligent people saying that it is correct. And they have pretty little animations to prove it. One of the problems, there's countless problems with plate tectonics, but one of the problems is that you need to move a giant plate on top of floating magma, or to move a floating plate on top of magma. You know what I mean. Shut up. You have to have what we call energy. You don't just, things don't move for free. You have to somehow generate current and energy to move that plate. And of course, it begs the question, where the hell does this energy come from? Now, a geologist can only say, well, it comes from the center of the Earth because the core spins magically because it does. Right, and they have all kinds of stupid excuses as to why the core of the planet is liquid and it spins and whatever. And I'm not going to waste any more time with that. But where did the energy come from to move the plates? Interestingly enough, real geology actually has proven scientifically that there is not enough energy on the planet to generate the motion required to move plates. There's no such thing. There is literally no scientific proof of that kind of energy being generated on the planet to move those plates. Even more interesting is that if we did have that kind of energy being generated, the Earth would essentially just be a molten ball, because that's a ton of energy. To sit there and smash two plates together, or to have one plate being forced over another, people truly do not appreciate the amount of energy required to do that. Right? That would just be, it's just unbelievable. And it begs the question, where the hell does the energy come from? There is an energy problem, and geologists do not have an explanation for it. They do not. There is no scientific explanation for that at all. No such thing. Right? Even something simple like the core of the planet, technically speaking, they have no idea what the hell is at the core. We have never drilled down to the core. Everything that our layers of the planet are based on, it's all based on simulations and calculations, based on soundings, that reverberate through the planet. Right? They assume that they are calibrated correctly when they do their calculations. Right? They have nothing to calibrate off of. We have no idea what's going on underneath our feet. None whatsoever. None. If you go 20 miles below your feet right now, we have no idea what's down there. None. Like zero. It's all theoretical. All of it. So what that means is that mainstream geology has no idea what they're talking about. Okay, mainstream geology, the way it is taught to us nowadays, it's not correct. And it's incredibly boring as well. I think a lot of people understand intrinsically when they first get their first taste of geology that something's not quite right with the mainstream version, but they don't have the tools, we don't have the tools to initially say why. Right? Oh, plates are smashing together. Well, I mean, okay, but really? Like that's your excuse? And of course, because we don't have the tools, we just believe it because it's not interesting anymore and we all move on. So, if plate tectonics and mainstream geology is not the explanation for where the mountains came from, then what is? All right, so this is where we start to get into ancient history and real science. I know, 20 minutes later, right? 20 minutes, because this stuff is just so annoying. It's just, okay, all right. So, a few thousand years ago, between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, using real chronology and real science, our planet had a close encounter with another planet. And that other planet was the planet Venus. Now, I'm not going to belabor the whole story of the Venus event, but the planet Venus, when she is in her cometary form, and this is recorded by every single culture across the planet, by the way, when she is in her cometary form and she almost hits Earth and Venus come really close at a very specific point in time, Earth is assaulted by massive cataclysms. And I cannot overstate the word massive or cataclysm enough. The destruction that our ancestors witnessed is just unfathomable. The survivors of this cataclysm are few and far between. Entire nations are obliterated down to the last person in many cases. Entire cultures are wiped out to the point to where there are only a handful of people left. And these survivors quite literally believe that they are the only ones that survived on the entire planet. And this is recorded in ancient histories everywhere. When Earth has an encounter with Venus in a cometary form, these two planets will interact in some incredibly destructive ways. We will focus on mountain building for now, and what I really want to focus on is I want to focus on the Andes and the Sierra Nevadas. The reason why is because I believe that this area is probably the most destroyed area of the planet that we have evidence of above the water today. In my opinion, during the Venus event, this is where the massive destruction takes place. Now, the good news is that it's not just me who makes this claim. I think that this concept is a relatively new one to the scientific and historical community. So I figured we'd get it out there a little more and talk about it so that we can start really figuring out if this is true or not. So during the Venus event, there's all kinds of cataclysms that take place, right? Continents sink, we have continents rising, we have entire shorelines being changed, we have, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, a literal mountain of water that gets pulled over the planet in certain areas. It's absolute destruction on a scale that's unimaginable. And even more stuff was going on. Whatever I just said is just part of it. You could probably just use your imagination, and it happened. Quite literally. Immanuel Velikovsky goes into a lot of this. He has huge chunks of some of his books that cover the Venus event. And of course, there's been countless other people now, great writers, great scientists, who have gone on to really confirm a lot of what Velikovsky claimed. And in fact, a lot of these people have discovered even worse stuff than what he was even proposing. Velikovsky was one of the first people, I don't know if he was the first person, I doubt it, but he was one of the first major authors to point out that it looks like mountain ranges really did rise up overnight. And even back then, there was scientific evidence to support that. Now, there's been more scientific evidence to support these claims, nowadays. But even back then, they were making the discovery. Velikovsky he made the connection between history and science. Right, so anyway. So Velikovsky doesn't focus on North America too much. And in fact, in all honesty, nobody really seems to want to focus on North America relative to this cataclysmic event, relative to the Venus event. Everybody, they love Egypt, they love Europe, they love Africa, they love South America, places where there are ruins, and I get that, right? Places where we have very interesting archaeology. In North America, we don't really have interesting archaeology, at least in the sense of the way it is in the mainstream. There have been unbelievable findings here in North America that have been suppressed. Like, they have literally found Egyptian tombs here. They have literally found entire weird underground situations, very nicely carved stones, all this crazy stuff. There's all this amazing stuff that was discovered when the Europeans came over. And of course, the Native Americans or the North American Indians corroborated where that stuff came from if they could. There was a lot of it that they didn't know where it came from either. Right, because the so-called Native Americans aren't native, right? They got over here relatively recently as well. Right? People don't like to hear that, but that's the truth, and that comes directly from them. Remember, it's not me making the claim, it's them. You don't like that? Go talk to them. Don't come to me. Don't write me an email. Okay, I don't care. This is what they say. I am going off of what they say. Anyway, because North America doesn't really have that mystique, North America, and I've talked about this in the past, it's a very fresh country for everybody. It's very much untouched. And that really does beg the question, why? Why is America so untouched? Mostly wherever we go on this planet, other continents have all kinds of signs of being lived in. Whether it's still on the surface or buried, several feet or hundreds of feet under the ground. There's these amazing discoveries everywhere except North America. Why? Why not here? What the hell? What was going on here? It's my belief now that the reason why North America is so fresh, so untouched, is that North America got hit the hardest by one of the more insane aspects of the Venus event. What I want to share with you guys now is the geological processes that have been discovered that might explain how destructive this event was, while simultaneously explaining where the Sierra Nevadas in the Andes came from. Now remember, Native or North American Indians, they all have stories of these mountains appearing overnight during a fight with the gods. For example, the Yakuts have a creation myth regarding the Sierra Nevadas, and the Appalachians as well, actually. So over here we have a situation to where eagle and crow are flying around in the sky, and what they're doing is they essentially start building up what they call mud. They start building up earth. And then over only a couple of days, what happens is that the Sierra Nevada mountains are essentially built. Right? They have a story where it only takes a couple of days to build this entire mountain chain. Now, of course, that sounds crazy if we're going to use plate tectonics, but what if there's another method of mountain building? What if there's another way to build these mountains? What if these mountains really were built overnight during a catastrophic event? A catastrophic event led by the planet Venus, who would also be known as Crow. You see, this stuff is right in front of us. You don't have to even use your brain. All you have to do is go and read what all of our cultures talk about, and the history is right there. The North American Indians have the story of what happened during this particular event, during what they would call the creation of the current world. Right? It happens quick. You don't need plate tectonics. Now, all right, so then what's going on? How the hell do we build mountains up overnight? We need to have some kind of a force doing this. You can't just have mountains appear overnight for free. Right? The energy has to come from somewhere. The material has to come from somewhere. Plate tectonics does not work. Right? The reason why plate tectonics doesn't work, think about it. Think about this. Okay, let's say you believe in plate tectonics, but you also believe in catastrophism. A lot of people will say there's a huge earthquake that really would have smashed these plates together, and as the plates really pushed together, the mountains would have been thrust upward, and you would see what you see now during a cataclysm. And a lot of alternative mainstream people go in that direction because it sounds good and it lines up with what they consider established science, established geology. However, if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, there's a problem. Right? The first problem is, just think about this. If you smash 2 plates together of rock, right? This is rock. You're smashing these 2 pieces of rock together. What happens to rock when you smash rock together? Right? Rock fractures, rock crumbles, rock breaks. Rock does not bend. And that's key, because what we find in the Sierra Nevada mountain range and everywhere else as well is we do not find all of this cracked rock, all of this shattered rock, all of this rubble. Instead, we find very perfectly layered rock, and we find rock that is bent. In some cases at 45-degree angles, at 50-degree angles. You have all of these weird angles, and it's not cracked. It is literally bent as if it was metal, as if the rock itself was molded. Now, the next thing that people will try to say is they'll try to say, well, heat and pressure, bro. Heat and pressure magically somehow bends rock. Really? Really? That's what you're going to go with? Heat and pressure does not bend rock. Right? You do not smash 2 pieces of rock together and heat and pressure magically appear and bend the rock. Rock is brittle by its nature. Rock will fracture. If you melt rock, you get a completely different situation. You certainly are not going to get these perfect layers layering one on top of another. How would the rock sort itself? Right? That doesn't even make sense. If you have all this rock, melting supposedly, this rock is not going to separate itself into layers. It's going to become one giant glob of lava. Right? You're not going to get layers. And you cannot tell me that, well, it was one layer, then another layer, then another layer, because that's not what happened, right? We need a catastrophe to have all of this happen simultaneously. So you can't have layers building up over time. It has to happen quickly. So the plate tectonic catastrophic version doesn't work. And then, of course, to top it all off, we don't have the energy to do it anyway. Now, energy's a problem because we still need energy to create the mountains. They're not just going to appear for free. It's not going to happen. So we need an energy source. We need something that can do this. Well, luckily enough, we have it. We have the energy source of electricity, of plasma, that whole realm, right? Electromagnetism. All of that stuff is what is going to provide us with the conditions necessary to create what the North American Indians record happening. We don't need plate tectonics. All we need is real science, real testable science. And now we can start to explain potentially kind of what happened on the North American continent. And by extension, really running all the way north and south to the poles as well. And we'll see that in a second. So what has happened is that there have been some very good researchers out there with respect to geological research that have made some amazing discoveries. One of those researchers is a guy named Michael Steinbacher, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. He passed away a while ago, unfortunately, but he's got some videos out there which I highly recommend watching because he really put two and two together, and using plasma physics and looking at the geology that we physically see right now. You know, he was able to actually put together a bit of a picture of what may have happened during the Venus event catastrophe, and we'll cover some of that. Another geologist, or I think he likes to be called a natural philosopher. Anyway, his name is Andrew Hall, and he has written some pretty good articles or write-ups or papers or whatever you guys want to call them that covers a lot of what we could call electrical geology. Now, there's other researchers out there as well who have done a lot of work in this area, but I wanted to just at least give some hardcore credit to two people in the community who really have, I mean, they've done some amazing work. I don't know what else to say. We don't have all the answers, and neither of these two guys claim we do, by the way. So if you're not familiar with their work, they're not, these people who are trying to take credit for all this garbage. They're just doing real science, and I really appreciate that. Okay, anyway. Yeah, I know. Enough dick writing, I know. Okay, but anyway, I wanted to make sure that we have a direction so that when you stop watching this garbage, you can go read real science and kind of get an idea of what we're looking at here. So we have a situation couple thousand, maybe 3,000 years ago. But chronology really does seem to point towards around 2,000 years ago that the Venus event took place. Now, the situation that we find with Earth and Venus coming into contact with one another is not that these two planets collide. They do not physically hit each other in any way, shape, or form. So it's really important to remember that, because sometimes I think Velikovsky will use the term collision. He's not talking about the planets physically touching surfaces. That's not what it is. They're just talking to one another. And the way they talk to one another is through electromagnetism. During this event around 2,000 years ago, Earth had a different charge potential. Venus had a different charge potential. When you have two bodies coming close to one another with different charge potentials and their corresponding electromagnetic fields touch, you are going to have interactions. And these electromagnetic fields that both the Earth and Venus had at the time is what is going to supply the power needed to create the situation to where North America will be absolutely ravaged by what was essentially a huge plasma hurricane storm from hell. Right? The entire continent of North America, as well as all the way down through South America, down to Antarctica, and up north, all the way up there around Alaska, and heading over there towards Japan, here we find the remnants of this amazingly destructive plasma storm. If you want to know why North America seems so fresh and untouched, in my opinion, this is why. Because what a lot of these researchers have discovered is that mountain ranges can appear overnight. But the process of having them appear overnight is unbelievably violent. I mean, it is a plasma storm from anybody's nightmare. It's insane. And when we look at the North American side, or the western side of the North American continent, we find that whole side is just riddled with mountain ranges. And there are all kinds of crazy formations here, but ultimately, if you zoom out from Earth and you look at the entire formation, you find a situation to where the western portion of the United States seems to be the focal point of a giant plasma storm. This is where the mountains will be created. Now, I don't know all the details on how the interaction with Venus and Earth specifically creates, or why it specifically creates, this plasma storm over the western half of the United States, or the west side of the United States. I can't tell you the details because I don't know. And I haven't found anybody that does know why, for whatever reason, it gets concentrated there and not somewhere else. It could be as simple as, hey, that's just where the Earth was rotating at the time, and that's just the area that got screwed. Or there could be more to it. It could be that in this area where the Sierra Nevadas are, there could be more conductive material in the crust that would have attracted this particular event. Now, I don't know. I don't know which direction it is. Could be both. I don't know. Just something to think about, something to keep in mind, because I guess ultimately, we don't have all the answers. But one of the answers that it does seem that we have now is that a picture of the catastrophe that took place on the North American continent is starting to make more sense scientifically. Remember, the entire planet is being screwed by the Venus event. This catastrophe is destroying everything. But the catastrophe has all kinds of different properties. Right? The mountain of water is not seen, for example, by everybody. People on the North American continent see it, and they see it a little bit in the European area. And they get the effects of it over there on the East Asian continent as well. Anyway, back to the plasma storm. So when we look at the Sierra Nevada formation, it's a very particular shape. It very much bulges out and is very wide on the western side of the United States. And then as you follow this chain up north and south, you watch it get thinner and thinner. What it looks like is that this part of the United States was the focal point of this giant either hurricane or tornado or cyclone of just pure plasma, whatever you want to call it, like whatever kind of storm. But it would have been one hell of a rotating storm. And the mountain ranges seem to follow that pattern. Now, even more interesting is if you look at this pattern and you compare it to something like a galaxy, you find that kind of a rotational situation to where it's thick in the middle and then the arms spiral out in the opposite directions from around it, right? That's exactly what we would expect to happen if there was some kind of a Birkeland current being employed in this situation. Right, so it begs the question, right? So what was going on with the Birkeland currents that were flowing both through Venus and Earth, right? How were they being directed during this contact? Is it possible? Okay, think about this. Is it possible that the Birkeland currents, North Pole and South Pole area, literally switches halfway through the planet, and then for like maybe for like a day, the North Pole is over the western part of the United States? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't think that's what happened. Anyway, but it's crazy because we don't know. We don't know what was going on specifically with the Birkeland currents relative to how they were interacting with each other while the two planets, were in contact. But whatever the case, something horrible happened over here in the United States. So what was the process that built up these mountains? All right, so here's what goes on. We have a lot of granite over here on the western side. The Sierra Nevadas are very granity, right? Granite everywhere. We have the largest granite pluton, if I remember correctly, over here in this mountain range. So where does this come from? How do you get this much granite? What's going on? Mainstream geology will tell us heat and pressure, plate tectonics, things get pushed up. Somehow none of this gets fractured. None of it turns into rubble. It's just perfect and builds up and then bends. Yeah, okay, whatever. So that's garbage. We can throw that away. So where do you get all this material? Well, is it possible that the material that builds up the Sierra Nevadas comes not only from material here on Earth, but also from space? Is it possible that the granite that we find that is built up does not bubble up from underneath the Earth, but instead came from the sky and then was affected by plasma storms and then created the granite through plasmatic processes? Now that might sound crazy at first, but when we look at the evidence, that's not really a problem. What actually seems to have happened is that the granite came from the sky. Now that might sound crazy at first, but if we have a ton of material being rained down onto Earth from Venus, right? It would have been full of just dust and technically molten material as well. What would have happened is that this electrical event that gets concentrated over on the western side of the United States would essentially start to coagulate all of this material on top of the current Earth's crust. So instead of mountains being pushed up from plate tectonics, now you literally have electricity attracting all of this material and focusing it in this side of the world, or on this side of the planet. And all of that dust, all of that debris starts to get sucked in, and then of course electricity self-organizes, and what it does is it starts to self-organize all of that dust and debris, and it starts compacting it into the mountains that we see today. That's the general idea. So when we look at North American Indian histories and they talk about so-called mud being built up over only a day or two, that's exactly what would have been happening. Now, they just use the term mud for general Earth, but you have all of this material in this catastrophe, and it's building up the mountains right in front of them. Now, I say right in front of them, we have to be careful, because the reality is, anybody who was even near this event was vaporized. Whatever civilizations existed in the western part of the United States, they were annihilated instantaneously. Right? They were just absolutely vaporized. For the most part, there's actually evidence of civilization being over here in the Sierra Nevadas that are, completely unknown. We'll get to that in a second. And in all honesty, this plasma storm will explain why we find the evidence that we find, but we'll get there. Anyway, when we look at the layers of the Sierra Nevadas, something becomes very interesting. Because below the granite that basically comprises the Sierra Nevadas, we find a situation to where there's all these sedimentary layers. Now, in the world of mainstream geology, this makes no sense. Right? How is it possible that we have sedimentary layers under the granite? You can't have that. So what geologists tried to do is they were like, I guess all of this sediment was kind of shoved under by subduction. Yeah, we'll do subduction. And yeah, that's what happened. That's how the granite got on top of it. The plates magically did that, and the granite wasn't affected, and it just rode on top of the sedimentary rock. Yeah. All right, it's stupid. To make matters even worse, the angles at which the Sierra Nevadas sit at do not match the sedimentary angles on the bottom. What I mean by that is that you can find what you find is all the mountain ranges basically from sea level on above. They're all at these really odd angles, and you see this everywhere. Like you can go walk outside and you can just see how everything is at like a 45-degree angle, an 80-degree angle. All of the layers on the surface that when we cut into it, these things are all at sharp angles. But when you get down to a certain point, suddenly everything is flat. It's very uniform. So it begs the question, how did only some layers get pushed up at angles if you're going to use plate tectonics, while others remained perfectly parallel? So somehow plate tectonics is picking and choosing what it decides to shove up, down, left, right, but there's no logic to it whatsoever. This is why we have to have things like millions and billions of years injected, because this allows a geologist to run away from the problem, because they don't have to answer it now. Right? But it's a serious problem. The stratigraphy of the Sierra Nevadas makes no sense at all. None of it does. And then, of course, to make matters even worse, we find all of these layers bent at weird angles all over the place. And they're bent. They're not cracked. It's not like the crust cracked and folded over. No. These angles look like the rock somehow magically melted and bent itself like it was metal. Okay, you can't get that through plate tectonics. That's not how rock works. By the way, a lot of rocks, when you melt them, you change their structure. You literally change the rock. If you melt granite, you don't get granite back later. That's not how that works. Okay, so you can't melt granite and then pour it out and get new granite. It doesn't do that. The heating of the rock changes the nature of the rock permanently. So it doesn't work. So you can't use heat and pressure. That makes no sense. And you can't use plate tectonics to describe any of this. So how do you get these angles? Well, once again, if we start to look at the plasma storm that was sucking in all of this material, both terrestrial and extraterrestrial, and it's being concentrated over here on the western half of the United States. You have all of this material being sucked in and being layered. As it's doing this, you have massive amounts of heat that are creating the granite itself for the first time. It is not melting granite and then re-solidifying it. It is creating it. The process, the plasmatic process, is what creates the granite. This continent-wide plasma storm, this planet-wide plasma storm, with the focal point on the western half of the United States, this is where all of that plasma is concentrated and is sucking in the material, and it is creating the rock, and it is layering the rock. And it's layering the rock using high velocity winds, supersonic winds. And once again, we can see this in the layering. You have a situation to where you have the windward slopes of the direction of the plasma wind layering all of the material, and then you have the leeward side that shows the layers themselves because the wind wouldn't build anything on that side. Right? This is why we have those weird formations. These are not eroded canyons. This is just how these things formed. It's literally that simple. This plasma hurricane took all of that material and created all of the geology that we find over on the western side of the United States. And this storm spreads out all the way from north to south. Now, when it goes to north to south, it thins out. Remember, like I said, it's like a galaxy. It's like the ends of a galaxy. The center of the galaxy of the formation would not, it's the shape, not an actual galaxy. Don't be a smartass. So the center is over the western side of the United States, and the arms spiral outwards north and south, where they end in Antarctica and where they end over there in Alaska-ish kind of area. If you look at South America, this is where the Andes will come from. Remember, the locals in the Andes have the same story, that the Andes rose overnight. This is why the Andes are a byproduct of this plasma storm that is taking place on this planet. Right? All of this material, for whatever reason, in this specific area is being drawn to this part of the planet, and it's literally just building the mountains up. This is why we do not find mountains as giant piles of rubble like we should find. If plate tectonics was responsible, it really should just be piles of rubble. That's it. Right? When you smash two rocks together, you do not bend the rock. It creates fractures and rubble and dust. That's all you would get. You would not get these awesome, amazing, huge, intact layers that also bend perfectly. You wouldn't get any of that. You can only get that through a plasmatic process. So when Venus shows up, she destroys this planet on another level. She sinks continents, right? She does earthquakes, all that crap. but she also raises mountain ranges. And the western side of the United States felt the full force of this cataclysm. Now, gets even more interesting because, of course, the question becomes, well, who was living over here? Was anybody living over here? You know, whatever the land looked like before this, it's gone. Like, we have no idea what this area looked like. Like, the area where the Sierra Nevadas now sit, who knows what this place looked like? It could have been anything, right? But all of that evidence was vaporized when this storm hit. Or at least most of it. One of the fascinating things, or one of the problems that we have over here, geologically speaking, is that miners in the Sierra Nevadas have made some very peculiar discoveries. They have found bones which are buried in solid rock hundreds of feet below the earth. Human bones. They have also found artifacts, and in one case they even found what looked like to be a wheel, encased in stone hundreds of feet below the ground. What the hell is going on? How do you get human artifacts encased in stone hundreds of feet below the ground? None of that jives with modern history. It certainly doesn't jive with the way that modern biologists believe humans evolved. It doesn't work. So what's going on? Well, the funniest part about this whole thing, first of all, is that the mainstream ignores these discoveries. They literally ignore them. They can't say they're hoaxes because they're legitimately physically there. We have the pictures, they were found. They're there. There's no way around it. The human remains, they will kind of try to still say it's a hoax, but, you know, there's no real way around it. There's been more than one discovery, right? So they have to ignore it because it doesn't work. But the question remains, how the hell do you get those kind of artifacts trapped into stone at that depth? Well, if you factor in this plasma storm, now you have your answer. Now you have a plasma storm literally layering all kinds of rock on top of whatever used to be on this part of the country. Whatever used to exist on the western half of the United States would have had rock literally layered on top of the civilization overnight. Now, of course, this process would have more than likely vaporized and destroyed pretty much everything. But, you know, the law of averages, something is going to survive, and that's exactly what happened. So, plate tectonics has no explanation for why we find human artifacts at that level under the earth on the western half of the United States. It doesn't make sense. But if we listen to what the North American Indians say about what happened here, suddenly things start to make perfect sense. We should actually expect to find all kinds of stuff, if it survived, buried hundreds of feet, or if not, maybe potentially thousands, in solid rock within the Sierra Nevadas. I guarantee you there are miners out there in this day and age that have made those discoveries, but they're not allowed to say anything. And in fact, mining agencies over here, they stopped releasing that information quite a while ago. Now, why did they do it? You know, there's a couple of explanations on that, but think about it, right? These mining companies no longer talk about their discoveries, and we know they're making more of them, and that's what we're missing out on. And it paints a completely different picture of humanity, and it's scientific. It's right there, like it's physical. Oh, I'm losing my voice. All right. So my main point in this whole thing was to at least point out that, a worldwide catastrophe such as the Venus event really would be worldwide, and that we need to look at everywhere on the planet to try and figure out what happened where. North America is almost completely ignored when it comes to catastrophism by the vast majority of the community, both alternative or mainstream or whatever. And it's because, like I said, right, there's not a whole lot to go off of here. Things get a lot better once you start to explore plasma and you start to look at geology through the eyes of electrical processes. Yeah, and suddenly everything changes. But the problem is that the reality that we find, the scientific reality, it's a lot. It's a lot for people to take in, and I understand that. So basically, what I'm telling everybody right now is that over North America, there was a huge plasma storm that covered the entire western half of the North American continent, and arched its way down north and south along South America and all the way up to Alaska and around up there, right on the eastern side of the of Asia. Right, this was no joke, but it's funny. While it's no joke and it's absolutely destructive, it's just one of many absolutely insane catastrophes that were happening simultaneously. Remember, while this plasma storm is completely reshaping and creating the Sierra Nevadas and the Andes, we have continents sinking. Right? We have, if Atlantis was real, and which it could have been, this is why I take Atlantis seriously now. You have that continent going down during this period of time. You have whatever existed in the Pacific Ocean also sinking, right? And all of these events are taking place simultaneously. This is the level of destruction that's going on. You have the Earth just covered in darkness from all of the debris. If you're wondering where all of this rock and debris come from, it's being sucked in not just from Earth, but Venus is just trailing tons of this crap. Venus is in cometary mode. In cometary mode, that means Venus is shedding charge and matter. Guess where all of that charge and matter will go at a certain point, right? There's a point to where Earth will literally enter the tail of Venus as Venus crosses over the Earth's orbit, right? We get inundated. This is where you have people talking about, 6, 10, 12 days worth of pure darkness. Because this is what happens. We get sucked into that tail, or we enter the tail. And that is where you can get tons of material to help build the granite. Oh, and it's funny also during this time as well, you even have oil raining down from the sky, by the way. Right? That's a whole other topic, but you have all of these processes taking place. And all of these processes are being dictated by electrical forces. This is what the mainstream has no idea about. This is why all of their ideas are ultimately wrong in a lot of cases, or at least not backed by the correct science, because they don't factor electricity into anything. It's just like cosmology, right? Electricity plays no role in space. None. Even though it's everywhere and, they admit that, it plays no role. It has no effect on anything. Same thing here on Earth, right? Electricity apparently does nothing. It could not possibly be relative to anything. It's insane. You cannot run science like that. That is the insanity of the mainstream. Okay. I know. I'm over an hour. What else can I complain about? That's it. I mean, we're good. I mean, you get it, right? So North America needs some more dedicated people because the North American continent really is insane. As a side note, if you're wondering what was going on the eastern half of the United States, well, that half of the United States gets overrun by the mountain of water, or by the mountains of water. Remember, Venus is dragging the ocean over the surface of the Earth for a period of time. This is also recorded by the North American Indians. And it's funny, they're able to outride the mountain of water. And the reason why is because the mountain of water is not rolling in at tsunami speeds. It's being slowly drugged because of the connection to Venus, right? Relatively speaking, that's going slow. They're able to get out of the way, right? They're able to warn people about this, right? So they start to move west. Well, of course, if you went too far west, you got vaporized, right? This is why almost no one survives. And in fact, in North America, the survivors are almost zero because North America is hit so hard. It is hit by a mountain of water. Simultaneously, you get hit by this huge plasma storm. Right? Can you imagine that level of destruction? Also, in my opinion, this is also what explains why we have things like the Great Salt Lake and we have all of this water that was trapped over here kind of in the middle of the Sierra Nevadas, because that water would have been the remnants of the ocean that splashed over once Venus and Earth discharged, and that mountain of water was no longer electrically attracted to Venus. Right, that water goes everywhere, and I believe that's why we have an area of salt in the Midwest, because that's where a lot of the salt water just got trapped. And then, of course, over time, it just evaporated. Right, there was nothing filling it, especially back during that period of time. Right? It's unbelievable how all of this stuff starts to explain everything you and I can see right now. You can go outside right now and you can do catastrophism geology because it's everywhere. Literally everywhere on this planet in the past 2,000 years has been completely reshaped. And then, of course, the zero event will happen, 700 years after this, after the Venus event, and that will mess with certain things even more. Certainly not to the extent, but okay. Yeah. Okay. You get it. That's it. I just babble. Just talking. Whatever.